Welcome, podcast listeners. I'm Jean Braithwaite here with Laura Ruiz and Zach Butcher to discuss Piper Kerman's book, Orange is the New Black, her memoir of her years spent in a women's prison in Danbury, Connecticut. So, how much did you enjoy this book, or did you?
I thought, after seeing, because I watched the show before
Right.
I read the book, I thought it was a it was more realistic than the show portrayed it to be. But in some ways, I thought the show was also more entertaining. But I thought that the message in the book was a lot stronger and a lot more important than it was in the show. So overall, I really did enjoy this book.
I also enjoyed the book. I didn't watch the show because I wanted to make sure that I read, because from what people were telling me, the show was not much, it was very fictionalized compared to the actual memoir. So I felt that I was going to experience the book first. I really enjoyed, she did a very nice job with the characterization and just, it was an easy to follow book that I enjoyed reading and I couldn't put down.
I felt that way too. I read it through twice, once prior to the start of the semester and once just before getting ready for this podcast. It's the kind of thing that for me is easy reading. Just I went through it very quickly, didn't have to force myself. I should say that it's because of the show that I became aware of the book at all. I noticed that Netflix had another new original series, and I took a quick look at it. I'm not wild about the TV show, but it did occur to me that since I knew that there was a memoir out there that went with it, that it would make an interesting exercise for my students, perhaps, to look at the differences between the original memoir and the fictionalized TV-sized version. I think it's good that we have one person who hasn't seen the TV show at all, and one person like me who's seen the whole thing, right, Zach?
Yeah. One of the hardest things, I wish I had read the book before I had seen the show, is because I kept picturing the characters of the show doing the things while I was reading them, and I really hate that about whenever you watch a movie first and then you read the book, and it's like you can't form your own faces. The faces are the actors, and they're always going to be that way. And so I don't know. I wish I read the book first.
I agree with you. That's why I said, no, I'm not going to do it. It wasn't a book that I didn't know anything about the show. And it wasn't a book that I would have picked out had I gone to Barnes & Nobles or any of the bookstores. But, of course, I had to read it for the class. But after I started reading, I just couldn't put it down. Like, I was trying to, because I have a very good friend that her family was imprisoned and so forth. So I was trying to see pretty much, except for my friend and her sister that were not involved. But I thought that I wanted to compare, what Piper was saying to what my friend had told me about her family and what they had endured.
Right.
So it very much, there was some differences, but a lot of the same thing was throughout the book. The food issue and the bond that they have with that Piper has with her friends, with Pop and well, not her friends, I would say maybe the people that are in prison with her.
Well, she certainly had friendly feelings toward many of them, and she's even put Pop in the dedications.
Yes.
In the front matter of the book, to Larry, to my mother and father, and to Pop.
You see, you put red there from the show.
Right, so that I wouldn't forget that
who they were. Yeah.
Yes.
Many of the characters were renamed in the show,
Which was important because a lot of the characters are different in the show than they are in the memoir as real people.
Right.
I didn't see the show, but when I tried today to log in and to my Netflix account and view, I did see pictures of the people. So I was like, crazy eyes, and then I started looking at and I was like, I would have never pictured it was just a complete, and I haven't seen the show. It was just
They completely changed the racial identity of Crazy Eyes.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't, I started questioning myself and going back to the book, and then I said, I'm going to stop here and just concentrate on what I've read and not look at the actual, cast there.
As far as I know, this is the only book Kerman has written. If she had other books, I would probably be interested in reading them. And this, for me, this is the first prison memoir I've ever read. but I've decided I'm going to read a few more. I think there's every reason to suspect that prison experiences differ radically. You said, Laura, that your friends reported some things different from Kerman.
And Kerman points those out too.
Yes.
That every situation is different, and I was in a specifically more advanced. I was special, so I didn't have to go through a lot of the problems that other people who are in prison had to go through.
She was in a minimum security prison, for one thing. She was in a women's prison, which the violence level differs radically, so I understand.
She was in Connecticut versus maybe Texas, California,
right,
bigger states with different, perhaps, populations.
And she had a life ahead of her that she knew was there, unlike a lot of the women in there who had no idea what was going to come after prison.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because as I was rereading the ending, she keeps going back and saying, I had a job and it was created for me. I guess somebody that she knew created this job for her, versus people, that have to apply and check off the felony, that just turns the employer off and they don't get the job. So I thought that was unique that she mentions, and that got me to think about, what are we doing with these people that get out? Is society even giving them a second chance? Most of the time they don't get that second chance, and she's lucky because she has all the support.
Right. The narrator is very much aware throughout the book that her experience is atypical, and that she is very highly privileged compared to almost everybody else that she writes about. So it could be argued that this book is not really even relevant to the prison experience or prison reform. But the fact that she herself is aware that she's atypical and continues to stress it throughout the book, it gives her credibility, even though her experience is not the worst of the worst that a person can have who enters the prison system.
But I think, as you mentioned, it gives her credibility. Going back to my friends, their experience was atypical. They had been, in this world of wealth and so forth, and imagine having to go to prison and not, they also felt like they had an atypical situation because they had money in their little account so that they could buy everything.
Right.
They still had, compared to other inmates that didn't have anybody that would go visit them, they still had family and people that cared about them. And I think that makes the difference for Piper. The fact that she does have that little lifeline going for her compared to other prisoners.
I think it makes, because Piper doesn't seem like the kind of person who belongs in prison. So if you're not the type of person who belongs in prison, if you don't fall into that category, you read this as if you're there and you see all the problems. So I think that's why it's really relevant, because people who wouldn't care about what's going on in prison because they don't have anyone who know anyone who is in prison or have any chance of getting into prison because of their background can read what Piper said through the eyes of someone who's like them.
I think that's an important insight. It's likely that Piper Kerman's readership is going to come from classes similar to hers, middle class, upper middle class, and above, rather than...
And on that note, I keep thinking, I always think, what if you just run a red light and you kill somebody and you end up in jail? That could be, like you said, it could be us reading, and that's why it makes such an impact for me. The fact, the way she narrates the things that she goes through and all that, and I keep thinking, it could be any of us.
Her experience, and she seems to be deliberately setting out to make this the case, that her experience can be a bridge to the middle class or upper middle class reader who never gives a thought to what's going on for the worst off people in our society. The fact that she is sucked into this.
Yes.
If a white middle class reader like me finds it easy to identify with a well-educated, well-spoken white middle class lady like Piper, then maybe that gives me a way to ease into experiences of people who are very different from me, whose suffering Piper has seen up close and shared to some extent.
Kerman mentions in her afterword that this indifference or inability to relate to people is not only the source of the problems in prison, but is also the source of the people getting put into prison. She says that crime happens because you don't personally understand what you're doing is harmful. And the reason why people are in prison and we have this horrible prison system is because people up top don't realize what the people at the bottom are going through. So it's just this weird,
or don't care.
Don't care.
They don't put themselves into that position.
Yeah.
Well, those people had it coming. You even yourself used the phrase "belong in prison" earlier. Well, maybe nobody really belongs there.
Yeah.
On page 298, since you mentioned Zach, the afterword, she puts this very beautifully. Lack of empathy lies at the heart of every crime, certainly my own. Yet empathy is the key to bringing a former prisoner back into the fold of society. What happens in our prisons is completely within the community's control. Is that the passage you're thinking of?
I think that when she talks about this, I think it could be, when I read that line, I kept thinking, well, I think it could be a message that could be sent to anybody. I think of it as, my analogy is like, well, I'm the teacher in the classroom, and my administrator forgets sometimes that I'm the teacher, and she gives me all these different things that I have to do. So I guess it could be related to different aspects, or at least I related it to different aspects of my life, and so I made that connection through that.
And also on that same page, I liked how she mentioned the lives of many of the people who she knew in prison, and she shows that they're very different. Some people are in a very similar place as her. Some people are in a lot worse place. So not everyone who goes into prison is the same, and that's something that our society has to get into our head, that people who go into prison or people who get arrested aren't all the same kinds of people. There are people like Kerman, or there are people like the people you think belong in there.
Well put. So let's talk about Kerman's particular voice as a writer. What is her style? We've discussed the content and sort of the message of the book. Her reviewers praise her for being devoid of self-pity. Kerman neither sentimentalizes nor lectures. That's the Boston Sunday Globe. Dave Eggers, this is a serious and big-hearted book. Depicts life in a women's prison with great detail and crucially with empathy and respect. I found it very funny, this book, but a particular understated, dry humor most of the time.
I did too. I compared it to the other book that we read, Packing for Mars, and I could catch on faster to that humor than I could catch on to hers, but it was still there. It was very subtle in my opinion, but then it was there. You would have to go in and maybe possibly, oh, that's what she meant, or oh, wow, that's why she made that comment. So that's how I saw the humor in this book.
I think that she's able to do a lot of the things, like not sentimentalize things or have that kind of humor, mostly because she decided to write this book years after she got out. Whereas if she was writing this book while she was in prison, while she was going through these ordeals, I think that humor wouldn't be there, and I think there would have been a lot of self-pity while she was writing it. But because she chose to write it years later, after reflecting on what happened, she's able to find the things that while in prison would have seemed horrible and try to find humor out of it, and be able to take responsibility for her actions instead of pitying herself because she's in this horrible situation.
Well, she had 5 or 6 years in advance of actually going to jail, of knowing what was going to happen, so I think she may have already achieved some amount of detachment way before the prison experience proper even began. In the opening scene, actually the very first page of the book, and Zach, I know you're going to discuss this a little later, but she plops us down in the beginning of her drug money running career, the very first time at the Brussels airport when she's trying to retrieve a suitcase full of cash. Because it was stuffed with drug money, I was more concerned than one might normally be about lost luggage. This is an example of that kind of understatement that I'm talking about. Obviously, if you're a person in her 20s who has just agreed to move more than $10,000 worth of cash illegally from one country to another, you're going to be frantic when that suitcase doesn't show up. So her saying, I was more concerned than one might normally be, is deliberately adopting this ironic tone toward herself, undercutting the emotion rather than playing it up. Comparing her to Mary Roach, as you did a minute ago, Laura, Mary Roach will often use hyperbole, you know. She has understatement sometimes too, but with Kerman it's always low-key, low-key.
Yes.
And I think it's because of her message that she doesn't want this to be entirely about her. That she wants this book to have a purpose bigger than her, and so she makes understatements, and she kind of hurries through the backstory to get to the meat, which is the prison.
But she does it very well, even with her characters. When she develops or she introduces her characters, she does it within, and I have a couple of pages that we could go back and refer to that, because she does it within one paragraph, and she doesn't overwhelm us with details, but it also entices you to keep on reading to see, okay, who else are we going to meet? Who else? She does it so well that I don't even think that the reader, really understands it until you actually look. Like on page 108, when she's talking about Pop, and she talks about, in just that paragraph, she tells us everything that we want to know about Pop, and how she was, Pop had lived a crazy life on the outside, arriving in this country from Russia at the age of 3. She was married out of her parents' house at 18 to a Russian gangster. The life together had included all the excessive disco splendor and on and on and on. And I thought that was so well written, because I could picture Pop. And she does it. Most people take forever to develop a character. She did it within that one paragraph. And she does the same with Esposito. So I'm like, wow, she does a really good job of that.
And I think she does really well, going back to the first chapter.
Okay.
When she's trying to describe herself, her background, she doesn't go into this long, she could write a whole chapter about her childhood, but what she chooses to do is in one paragraph talk about her graduation, and set up, just in that paragraph and just in that one scene, you can understand Piper's background. And I think that's a really smart way to write something when you're trying to...
This is on page 4.
4, yeah.
The scene that you're talking about. Opening scene is the crime scene at the airport in Brussels, and then from there, she immediately flashes back to her graduation a year before. And that's where she fills us in on the family background. Would you like to read a few sentences from that?
She opens a scene. My graduation processional at Smith College, which Smith College, we have talked about in class, is a really wealthy women's-only college. So picking that scene at Smith College would show that she comes from a wealthy background. She goes on, the year before was on a perfect New England spring day in the sun-dappled quad. Bagpipes with whined, and Texas Governor Ann Richards exhorted my classmates and me to get out there and show the world what kind of women we were.
A little irony there, what kind of women we were. She's going to get out there and be a drug money runner.
She later goes on and talks about her grandparents. My freshly separated parents were on their best behavior. My stately southern grandparents pleased to see their oldest grandchild wearing a motorboard and surrounded by wasps. That sentence kind of shows that I'm the typical white person. Divorced parents, stately southern grandparents who are happy to see you surrounded by only white people.
Yes.
And it's just in one sentence you already have this picture of who Piper is. And without really even talking about Piper.
Right, or without saying much about her family either as specific individuals, but generic types.
And I think it would go with, if you read her interview, where she talks about the toughest part about writing this is that she's really, truly a private person. And so I think that a lot of this very, very quick and simple explanation about her life comes from that, where she doesn't want to go into detail because she's really a private person. She doesn't want to go into great detail about her family or her background. And
it's just enough to keep you going and keep you interested. And I think she does it very well throughout the memoir.
These are instances where background is filled in very quickly. But then, of course, there are scenes that play out in real time where we spend many sentences and paragraphs and even longer dwelling lovingly over the details of what exactly is occurring both outside and inside Piper's mind.
Yeah.
I think it's just smart writing where you only need to know this about me. You don't need to know everything about me.
Right.
Because this is important to what I'm trying to tell you in the bigger picture.
It's not a biography. It's a memoir of a specific experience. Like the subtitle says, My Year in a Women's Prison. Although, in fact, the first 2 chapters go beyond the year in prison.
I have a couple of things. When I first started looking at the book, and I kind of looked at before I read it, I looked at the questions for discussion, and then I read the book, which we had talked about.
That's smart reading.
And the first question there says, on, I believe it's page 325, the first question says, Piper, a graduate of Smith's College and arguably an unlikely candidate for incarceration, gets involved in a drug ring shortly after graduation. This dangerous activity stands in sharp contrast to her previously safe, law-abiding life. What do you think precipitates Piper's foray into crime? What might have made the drug world so enticing? So as I was reading and reflecting on that particular, after I read the memoir, I said, what would have made it? Is she a victim of fate, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time? But then I went back and I said, no, she was probably like, I know I've been there, and I don't know about you guys, but when I was young, I did dumb things, not as dumb as Piper, or got myself into a situation that way, but on page 5 she says, I was a well-educated young lady from Boston with a thirst for bohemian counterculture and no clear plan, but I had no idea what to do with all my pent-up longing for adventure. So I think that was really what made her just explore Nora's world, because it was a sense of adventure, a sense of getting taken by the world of drug money and everything else.
She had fallen for this sexy, tough-talking, smart older woman.
Yeah, and on page 6, when you say that, she talks about how the first paragraph there says, among our loose social circle was a clique of impossibly stylish and cool lesbians in their mid-30s. So that was what she was like, oh, she was drawn to it. I mean, I can picture myself being in my 20s and surrounded by somebody like that. Of course you're going to be drawn to it because they exhibit everything that you might be wanting to experience, and that you feel like you just want to live every day to its intensity. And I think that was one of the things that...
This could very easily have happened to me.
Oh, yes. I thought about that, too.
It could happen to anyone, I think. I think this is a situation where you're in a relationship with someone and you trust them to a point where you would do things that will hurt yourself, but you're just so intoxicated by love, I guess, or by attraction.
And she mentions on page 9, there's another good that mentions that. It says, I wanted an adventure, and Nora had one to offer. Nothing bad had ever happened to the guys from Northampton who had gone with her to these exotic places. So she did think about it, and she just rationalized and said, nothing bad happened, so, let me go and have some fun and experience this adventure, this time in my life. And so I thought, she craved that adventure. So I think that's what that adventure and the attraction to Nora and everything that she would, it could happen to me. It could have happened to me. I could have been Piper. I thought to myself as I read and kept on looking, I guess it would, and then also the play with, her parents had recently gotten divorced. So there was like no family bond there. She just didn't want to have it perhaps at that time. So it led her right into Nora's path.
I think Piper's relationship with Nora is a very interesting relationship. It's not covered a lot. It's covered in the beginning and towards the end, and that's it. And I think that the transformation from Nora as the character that you see in the opening scene in the first few chapters is someone that you're not supposed to like. And then you get to the last chapter, which is diesel therapy, or the last 2 chapters are diesel therapy, and it can always get worse. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, Nora, the character, is someone that you can not necessarily pity, but you get. Piper's relationship with Nora was better because of the prison's experience. She took responsibility from what she did. She stopped blaming her for everything. And she even kind of hints to a friendship based on necessity and how that helped her accept responsibility for what she did.
I can't agree that up until the final meeting with Nora that Piper is putting blame on other people. She's already in her 30s by this point. She's already lived an adult life and come to grips with her own responsibility and that she's going to prison. In the courtroom, when she's being sentenced, she tells the judge, I accept responsibility, and she seems sincere in that.
But she hated Nora for a reason that she put her in that situation. And I think that she always hated Nora until she ran into her again at that prison, and that changed a lot of it. Like, she may have accepted responsibility a lot, but I think that deep down inside, especially with this huge hatred towards this person, that she still in some way blamed Nora.
Subconsciously. Yes, I can see
and
that.
it is at that moment where she even talks about how the relationship changed from being one that she hated to, on page 280, she says, we were able to settle into a feisty repertoire like all ex-lovers who have a lot of water under the bridge.
Nice. There's one more thing I'd like to point out in chapter 1. The incident where Nora dares her to jump off a waterfall into a pool below. A lot of times people don't realize that the memoir writer is just like a fiction writer, entitled to use symbols. And the dare to jump, and then her creeping out onto the ridge and wanting to retreat, but realizing at that point that she couldn't retreat. She had no choice but to just go ahead and take the plunge.
And what does Nora say? I would have never done that. Like that, and she even says that that's the moment I should have known. I should have just left her, because she was like, yeah, you should do, and then she does it. I would have never done that. Is that the kind of person you want to trust?
She says, you're crazy.
Yeah.
You're crazy. She says, I would have never done that. Yeah.
Well, let me point out in Nora's defense that after Piper jumped, she went ahead and jumped after her.
Yeah.
So that even though your goal as a nonfiction writer is to tell the exact truth about what actually occurred in the real world, you can use the same kind of symbolic incidents or things or actions can have additional symbolic significance if you choose to line them up and juxtapose them that way. And her putting the story about the jumping from the waterfall seems to suggest parallel in her own risk-taking behavior and in her relationship with Nora, that Nora would egg her on to do things. I'm trying to say that it's a sort of a collaborative effect between Nora's pushing and her own personality. So that even from the very beginning, even from chapter 1, she's not blaming all one or all the other, that it was a synergistic effect. That's the word I was looking for.